Well, there's also an irony here, which is that apparently with trans, it's okay to adopt the opposite sex and take on even an entire identity of the opposite sex. And that's not
There
like,
it is. There it is, right there.
yeah, so apparently that's okay, but it's not okay even to have a hairstyle that's superficially similar to like another race subculture. It's pretty ridiculous. Hi everyone, welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for August 25th, 2025. We are here with Sylvia and me, Ariane. We would like to begin with an announcement from WDI USA. WDI USA is excited to invite you to our fourth annual convention from September 19th to 21st in Indianapolis, Indiana. This year, our focus is on growing the women's liberation movement. Topics covered will include advocacy for incarcerated women, the fight for abortion rights, combating misogynoir, creating in-person women's groups, the effects of pornography on women, successes in the fight to protect women's sports, and what's next for detransitioners. The convention will be followed by an action at the NCAA Hall of Champions in support of women's sports. This is a women-only event. Register by August 31st. The registration link will be included in our show notes. And now we'll move on to the news. First, a summary. The Alaska Medical Board moves to prohibit pediatric medical transition. Canadian physician and researcher Gordon Guyatt apologizes for offending trans activists. World Boxing announces sex testing for athletes. And a woman is denied entry to a queer arts venue in Vancouver due to culturally appropriative hairstyles. And we begin in Canada. In a controversy involving Canadian doctor Gordon Guyatt, hat tip to whistleblower Ethan Haim for reporting on the story on X. Guyatt is the founder of EBM, or evidence-based medicine, and developed a system called GRADE, which evaluates the strength of evidence quality for medical interventions. In January of this year, Guyatt supervised two reviews evaluating the strength of the evidence in favor of medical gender transition for minors. One review looked at puberty blockers, and the other looked at hormonal interventions. And both reviews found low certainty of evidence for the efficacy of these interventions. These findings did not make supporters of so-called gender-affirming care happy. And as Haim reports, on August 14th, Guillaume and his colleagues involved in the reviews published an apologetic statement on the website for McMaster University's Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence, and Impacts. The statement expressed regret that the findings of the reviews are being used to advocate for limits on medical gender interventions for minors. Weirdly enough, it stands by the assessment of low certainty for evidence in favor of so-called gender-affirming care. It just says that the low quality of the evidence shouldn't be enough to deem such care as bad or ideological. It says, quote, "It is profoundly misguided to cast healthcare based on low certainty evidence as bad care or as care driven by ideology, and low certainty evidence is bad science. Many of the interventions we offer are based on low certainty evidence, and enlightened individuals often legitimately and wisely choose such interventions. Thus, forbidding delivery of gender-affirming care and limiting medical management options on the basis of low certainty evidence is a clear violation of the principles of evidence-based sharing decision-making and is unconscionable. The appropriate use of our work is ensuring patients receive needed care and in helping TGD patients and their clinicians in decision making." Unquote. I find this statement strange because it doesn't explain what should, in fact, determine whether gender medicalization is valid, if it's not evidence-based. What's the criteria here? Is it based on what patients want and demand? Are doctors allowed to just do what they want according to their own personal assessments? Are there certain advocacy groups that determine what medical interventions are good or not? Are medical ethicists expected to chime in here? What is the standard for good medicine if it's not evidence-based? The statement goes on to say it will no longer accept funding from the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, or SEGM, an organization founded in 2019 which is critical of gender ideology. Now, I can understand why researchers would want to eschew partnerships with organizations with ideological biases, even if they are aligned with my own views, since it can damage the credibility of their findings. For example, when I and other anti-gender ideology protesters had a conversation with a doctor in front of the American Endocrine Society convention, the doctor said he didn't trust research funded by the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. But I'd like to know what organizations Guillaume and his colleagues are willing to work with, given that the ideological capture is so pervasive amongst donors. Sadly, even professional organizations are biased. So, what are reliable sources of partnership? Who will Guillaume and his company of researchers work with in the future? So, overall, this is a rather worrying development that goes to show how strong gender activists remain in the medical field. I often hear people say that the tide is turning, but that statement means nothing when things like this keep happening. Thankfully, Itan Haim noticed this incident, but there could be other stories like this that escape our radar. As I keep telling people, remain vigilant. And now for the news on pediatric transition in the US. On August 22nd, the Alaska Medical Board unanimously passed draft regulations to sanction medical providers that offer medical gender transition for minors. Medical providers who run afoul of the prohibition could face revocation of their medical licenses. It should be noted that nurses and nurse practitioners are not subject to the board's regulations. These new rules have not yet been finalized. However, state law enforcement still needs to review these regulations, which will be followed by the opening of a 30-day public comment period. The change in regulations was suggested by Dr. Matt Helala, a pediatrist running for governor. It's not surprising that the Alaska Medical Board would endorse these new regulations. Earlier this year, on March 26th, it asked the Alaska State Legislature to ban pediatric medical transition. No such ban was passed by the legislature, and in fact, Alaska is, I believe, the last red state not to ban pediatric transition. It's interesting in that it looks like the Medical Board of Alaska is moving faster than the legislature. And I don't know about the politics of Alaska to know why that might be. But in any case, assuming these new regulations do in fact go through, that will mean that only blue and purple states will be left as allowing pediatric medical transition. And as I've reported before, even blue states are seeing pediatric gender clinics close in the face of national executive orders. The proportion of America that continues to allow transitioning kids is shrinking. And with that, I send it to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Ariane. World Boxing has set new guidelines for determining the sex of participating boxers. Rather than separating the male and female category by what sex marker they have on their travel or birth documents, World Boxing will now be testing the biological sex of every boxer through the use of a one-time cheek swab. This style of sex testing was first adopted by World Athletics, as we've reported previously, and it appears World Boxing is now following suit. Interestingly, World Boxing was recently made the governing body of boxing internationally by the IOC, International Olympic Committee. This means that any boxers wishing to compete in the 2028 Olympics will have to undergo this new sex testing protocol. All of this comes after the controversy of Iman Khalif from Algeria, who won the women's gold medal for boxing in the 2024 Olympics. Iman insists on being biologically female, despite there being evidence that Iman has XY chromosomes, but with a developmental sex disorder. In other words, an intersex condition, but is male. Another Olympic boxer who also faced controversy for being a male with a DSD was Taiwan's Lin Yu-ting. Lin Yu-ting also competed in the female category, despite there being speculation of Yu-ting's biological sex. Moving forward, Lin Yu-ting confirmed to submit the necessary sex tests for the 2028 Olympics, thereby confirming once and for all if they are eligible to compete in the female category. Could this one-time cheek swab test be the future for sex-segregated sports? Transparency says, here's to hoping. And finally, a Canadian woman denied entry to a queer space because of her hair. A woman looking to attend the Bassett barbecue at the Birdhouse in Vancouver was denied entry due to her hairstyle. The Birdhouse is a, quote, queer and trans run place where you can find drag, dancing, and queer art in Vancouver, Canada. A video of the confrontation was posted on X by Canadian journalist Alex Zoltan. In the video, the white woman attendee with dreadlocks claims her hairstyle was influenced by the Vikings and Celts, and hence, presumably, is not cultural appropriation of Black African cultures. She also complains about having to drive 5 hours to the event from Headley and camping all weekend, only to be turned down. A worker for the event insists that the event organizers distributed their guidelines on cultural appropriation to the attendees ahead of time. The employees also fault the attendee for using the word retard. Apologies for using that word in the quote. They do end up refunding her the $60 she spent on the ticket, though the attendee persists in arguing, saying that she braided her dreadlocks, that she has Black relatives, and that she is disgusted by the discrimination against her. She then offers to take her hair out at the end to be able to enter, but the employees refuse. The Birdhouse has an in-depth cultural appropriation policy where they make clear their expectations and enforcement procedures. They specify, quote, if an individual shows up at an event wearing culturally appropriative clothing, hairstyle, etc., a member of the Birdhouse team will approach them to engage in conversation. The Birdhouse team member will explain or offer a reminder of this policy to the individual. A, without making assumptions about the person's race, and B, giving the individual an opportunity to respond, clarify, or express their feelings. In the event that the individual does not choose or is unable to remove the culturally appropriative hairstyle or clothing item, they will be asked to leave the space for the remainder of the event. The individual is welcome to return to the venue on a different occasion, provided they are no longer engaging in cultural appropriation. End quote. The cultural appropriation policy goes on to explain why Black hairstyles deserve special and specific attention. Quote, the relationship between white supremacy and Black hair dates back to the 1700s in Louisiana with the enactment of the Tignon laws, which required Black women to cover their hair with tignon, or a headscarf. Though these laws were abolished in the 1800s, the systemic marginalization of Black folks, and in particular Black women and femmes, on the basis of hair persisted. Today, there is great inequity in the status according to Black hairstyles in the mainstream, where they are considered cool and fashionable on the one hand when worn by non-Black folks, and are considered unclean and unprofessional when worn by Black folks. End quote. The policy goes on to explain the harms of Black hairstyle appropriation further down the policy. If you are interested in reading their policy in full or would like to watch the original confrontation video yourself, you can find the link to both in the video description below. Well, Ariane, what do you think about that? Being denied entry after 5 hours of driving and needing to pee and camping and all of the things that this woman had to put up with? Or do you think the Birdhouse was in the right?
Well, it's interesting because I always hear these rumors about people, being criticized for cultural appropriation. I didn't realize that there were like some organizations like that that had these very clearly spelled out policies against it. I looked and apparently they're on Eventbrite, and on Eventbrite they have their policy against all this cultural appropriation stuff. So um I didn't realize how blatant some of these organizations were, and it doesn't surprise me that the person, or sorry, that the organization that did this is a queer, whatever. It was an exceptionally long acronym, like an LGBTQ plus two spirit, whatever, group would do this because, that subculture is often very mixed up with the sort of anti-cultural appropriation subcultures and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean this is almost comical even by that standard.
Yeah, when you watch the full video, it really does seem like something that would be out of like a sketch comedy routine, but it's very real. And um, as someone who hates driving, I can appreciate the woman's distress at having driven hours and hours and hours to go to this event and only to be denied entry and to have to pee on top of it. I don't fault her for her frustrations. On the other hand, this place makes it very clear who they do and do not allow into their space. I guess the question is was her hair cultural appropriation if she was wearing it to honor her Viking roots, supposedly? I'd be curious who makes these calls as to what is and is not cultural appropriation. They do clarify in their policy page, that they've consulted Black members of the community on making these rules. Uh, I try to think back to when I was deep in this sort of mindset. Um, and it's a very interesting glimpse into like the thought policing and you know just the policing of behaviors and looks and everything, and it which is fine if that's what you want your space to be, but then I don't know, can you still call your place an inclusive place? I don't know. I'd be so curious to hear what our listeners have to say, especially after they read the policy and read the justifications that they have within the policy as to why they're very strict about this. Is it a net positive or is it asinine? Yeah.
Well, there's also an irony here, which is that apparently with trans, it's okay to adopt the opposite sex and take on even an entire identity of the opposite sex. And that's not
There
like,
it is. There it is, right there.
yeah, so apparently that's okay, but it's not okay even to have a hairstyle that's superficially similar to like another race subculture. It's pretty ridiculous. And I mean, it's the same thing, about like why is it so scandalous when you have like Rachel Dolezal or whoever, claim to be black when she's actually white, or you have all the, pretendians who are white but claim to be
Right.
Native Americans, and that's totally verboten. But we can do it when it comes to the opposite sex. It doesn't make a
Right.
lot of sense when you think about it.
It does not make any sense. And I would be curious to ask this venue if they could define the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. Um, because I think that that's something to be said too. And I just sometimes I feel that we can try to be anti-racist so hard that you just kind of come full circle and then you're just being racist again. I was kind of shocked when they said, well, just yeah, read the policy and decide for yourself if you think that they are actually being racially insensitive, to use their terminologies, within their own policy, to try to justify the use of the policy. I don't know. It's as somebody who used to live within that framework, again, I'm trying to think how I used to justify the beliefs and what I still agree with, what I don't agree with. But I think you just hit the nail right on the head with the one form of appropriation is no, not at all. And then the other is the whole venue is run by uh, trans people and queer folks. So it's the hypocrisy is astounding for sure. I'm glad the woman got refunded her money though. I hope she could pee somewhere.
Yeah, and it's weird because I mean, when I was growing up, I just associated dreadlocks with hippies, kind of like I didn't the whole angle that that was cultural appropriation, I didn't encounter until later in life. And I think the cultural appropriation concern was kind of started with a nucleus of something like, Native Americans don't want people wearing their headdresses because that has a particular symbolic cultural meaning to them. Like it's like wearing war medals, sort of. And then that sort of gradually expanded to include more and more examples of cultural appropriation. And I agree, Sylvia, that I'd like to see more parsing out about how do you draw the line between the cultural appropriation and appreciation.
Because I do think that the sharing of cultures is an important step towards unity and understanding and um, building bridges. And I do think that there's a line between appropriation and appreciation, and you won't find that line if you are super fascist about things and have guidelines that are really, really strict and leave no room for conversation whatsoever. So I'd be very, very interested to hear what our listeners have to say about this whole situation.
And on that note, thank you everyone for joining us for another weekly news roundup. We are going to skip next week because of Labor Day weekend. Everyone enjoy your Labor Day weekend, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. And remember, LGB Alliance USA hosts various events on Zoom for LGB people to meet, socialize, and talk about current events and topics of interest. For a full schedule of our upcoming meetings, please go to lgbausa.org/upcoming-events. Hope to see you again, and remember to like and subscribe.